Is Facebook stock a buy in 2020? That's a question that I've actually received a couple times already. And while I have made a couple videos on Facebook not too long ago, I think it's just one of those stocks that a lot of people kind of want to hear about because, well, number one, it is one of Jeremy's biggest stocks. So I think here on YouTube, it's just a popular stock because of especially because of Jeremy, but also because the stock is trading pretty high near some record levels. So I think it is a fair question to ask. Now, you guys, of course, should always do your own research and make your own decisions, but in my personal opinion, even at these higher prices, and especially if the stock, dips in 2020 or if we have some kind of market correction, yeah, I actually do think that it is a very good long-term stock, foundational stock that one could really build their entire portfolio around. And in today's video, I'm going to give you all the different reasons why I think this. And so we're going to talk about the pros, like the business or performance and all of their future potential. We're going to talk about the cons, like the recent issues with the whole antitrust concerns and the previous data privacy scandals. And then at the end of the video, I'll also give you my overall conclusion as someone who is actually not invested in Facebook stock myself, at least not at this moment. So it should be a fun one. I hope you guys enjoy this. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back, guys. Let's go ahead and get started by taking a look at the stock, and then we'll start talking about the pros and cons as well. Okay, now in the past 5 years, the stock has soared by over 165%, but what's interesting is that it's really not that much higher than the highs they saw back in 2018, and that's because the stock was crashing pretty heavily around the second half of that year. I remember a lot of bears left comments around that time in some of my videos saying some really negative things like the company was going to go out of business because of their privacy issues and that Facebook as a platform itself was dead and nobody would keep using it. But we'll talk more about that in just a second because they were way off. Now, in any case, the recently strong performance has led to their trailing PE ratio climbing this past year, although it's still significantly lower than it was in prior years. And I guess now would be a good time to just go ahead and transition to the pros, since I actually think that their valuation is more than reasonable even at these higher levels, as long as you're kind of thinking long term and once you consider what you get in return. In fact, when comparing them to other dominant players in the digital advertising and kind of social media markets, their forward PE ratio is significantly lower than most of them, like for example Twitter, Tencent, Microsoft, and Google. And it's only higher than really Baidu, which is mostly just a player in the Chinese market anyway. It's also cheaper than Amazon, but of course that's pretty much a given as almost anyone trades cheaper than them. But those are just kind of some competitors that I just kind of thought of off the top of my head. But when also comparing Facebook to the sector median, they only trade about 13% higher on a forward PE basis. And I think anyone looking at Facebook objectively would agree that they probably deserve to trade for a significantly higher premium than just 13% above the median. That seems pretty low to me. Meanwhile, their PEG ratio that looks out a few more years into the future is actually 32% cheaper. So in other words, Facebook is essentially trading like some sort of average kind of stock that isn't really doing anything special or overly impressive. But in reality, Facebook is already one of the most dominant companies in the entire world and are still finding ways to keep growing at ridiculously high rates, especially for their size. Last year alone, they did over $55 billion in sales, and even in the next 2 years, they're expected to continue growing by well over 20%. And it feels like every time I look at these future estimates, they just keep climbing higher on any revisions by analysts. Meanwhile, profits have also taken off very sharply, with net income topping $22 billion last year, which, by the way, that means that close to half of their sales went straight to their bottom line, which is extremely good for a company that is still growing at such high rates. Usually these type of high growth companies wouldn't have such large profitability, as they would need to continuously reinvest back into the business to keep their sales growing. But because Facebook is a dominant player in digital advertising, which is a very high margin business, they're able to remain extremely profitable despite the constant reinvestments in growth, and also all the fines that they've been dealing with, all of the recent scandals and things like that, which we'll also cover. And that's led to a balance sheet that has only grown stronger and stronger over time, as they've now stockpiled over $62 billion of current assets, which is basically money that they'll have in their hands within the next year. Now, they don't list any long-term debt, so I'm not really sure how they calculate it, but their current assets alone is more than double all of their total liabilities combined. So it's really an insane ratio for the amount of money that we're talking about. This isn't just like some little tiny company that happens to have a good balance sheet. This is one of the largest companies in the entire world with nearly $125 billion of total assets, yet they still have a current and a total ratio of both over 4. And if you don't know what those are, it basically just means that this is a sick balance sheet and one of the absolute best in the entire world. So that's basically where Facebook stands right now, at least kind of financially. But let's take a closer look at their business and take a look at what their future potential looks like as well. And then we'll cover the cons and we'll finish up the video with my overall conclusion. Okay, so like I mentioned before, this is a very dominant leader in the digital advertising market. Now, they're not necessarily number one. That honor actually goes to Google, which by the way is another really solid stock to build a portfolio around as well. But in the case of Facebook, according to eMarketer and Statista, they currently hold this sort of duopoly with Google, although Amazon is quickly becoming a bigger threat, but Facebook is still only at about 22% market share, while Google holds the highest amount at closer to 40%. But that also means that Facebook has more market share to steal, while Google seems to be losing some, as they are expected to drop a little from 2018 to 2019, while Facebook's is actually still growing. And by the way, just because market share growth is low or even declining in the case of Google, it doesn't really matter because growth in the market is still surging overall, with expected ad spending to surpass over $500 billion by 2023, and that's ultimately helping these giant companies. And by the way, notice here that according to Statista, the vast majority of that growth is actually coming from social media. And guess who arguably has the biggest social media presence in the world? Yep, that's going to be Facebook. In fact, for all the haters that kept saying everyone is done using Facebook itself, they actually grew their daily active users last quarter by 9% year over year to over 1.6 billion users, and also grew their monthly active users by 8% to nearly 2.5 billion. And that's just Facebook alone. When you include other platforms like Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger, the total number climbs to around 2.8 billion. And by the way, that's counting people that double dip on multiple platforms as just one user. So if you were to separate it by total accounts, the number would probably be astronomically higher. But just their user count alone equates to close to around 40% of the world's total population. So that's very impressive. And that's also despite all the recent scandals that we'll get into in just a second. But just looking at Instagram alone, they surpassed over 1 billion users back in mid 2018. So that number is likely much bigger by now. And given the growth trend, it'll likely keep growing at some very large rates and generate even more ad revenue for Facebook in the future. Speaking of which, all these platforms helped Facebook's revenue jump by nearly 30% last quarter, while net income was also up by almost 20%, and that's despite them investing so heavily on added security and data privacy measures because of all of those related scandals that, again, we'll take a look at in just a second. But their total headcount had actually increased by nearly 30% as a result. So for them to still grow their profits by so much, it just shows how powerful Facebook's business is, and in my opinion, it shows how undervalued and really underappreciated they are as a company. Speaking of which, their business doesn't just stop here, as Facebook is putting their money to work by investing heavily in other areas to fuel future growth. That's evident in things like Facebook Workplace for the business enterprise market, Oculus for the augmented and virtual reality markets, Facebook Dating for the online dating market, Facebook Watch for the original programming and video on demand markets, including partnerships with certain brands like the NFL to stream their content, more shoppable posts and storefront pages on things like Facebook and Instagram for the e-commerce market, and they're even launching their own cryptocurrency for the kind of digital money markets as well, called Libra. Although that has been facing a lot of challenges lately, but it still has a lot of future potential if they can figure out ways to execute in the future. And there's even more areas that we just don't have nearly enough time to talk about, like a cloud gaming acquisition, as well as the building of their own operating system, just to name a couple. All of this leaves me thinking that Facebook is a no-brainer as a very solid kind of foundational long-term stock to build a portfolio around. But are there any concerns that could actually derail Facebook in the future? Well, a couple that come to mind would be the privacy scandals and then the antitrust issues. So let's quickly cover those and I'll give my opinion on them. Now, when looking at the data privacy scandals that plagued Facebook throughout much of 2018, that really started when political consultant Cambridge Analytica wrongfully accessed personal data from 87 million Facebook users, and then it later escalated to other security mistakes and issues throughout the year, and that ultimately resulted in Facebook having to pay billions of dollars in fines as well as much higher operating costs as they had to invest heavily in added personnel to increase their security on their platforms, which I mentioned earlier in the video. The result is that their EPS is actually expected to drop by as much as 15% this fiscal year after having been charged a record-breaking fine of $5 billion by the FTC. But in my opinion, this is not a big enough issue to really derail Facebook over the long term, as they are clearly growing their profits again, as was evident in their last quarter, and their EPS is still expected to recover to double-digit growth on average over the next 5 years despite the recent drops. And as far as the data privacy issues, kind of scaring away users, that's also been proven to be false, as I showed you that user growth has remained high even at these gigantic levels. Now, granted that user growth on Facebook has to come to a halt at some point, but that's not going to stop them from finding more ways to monetize the platform or grow users in other areas like Instagram. Now, the other issue is the whole story that everyone keeps talking about right now, and that's the government probe into anti-competitive practices by giant tech companies like Amazon, Google, and of course Facebook, and all of the discussion surrounding whether these tech titans should be broken up into smaller companies because they have too much power and they're too large. But in my personal opinion, it's all really speculation on what will happen and when it'll happen. So until we have more definitive outcomes, I really wouldn't make too many investment decisions based off of these speculations. And again, this is just my opinion, but because Facebook offers a free service to their users, I feel like it's pretty hard to actually build a strong enough case against them because nobody is really forcing you to use their platforms. Now, granted, they do have a lot of power in terms of like influence and things like that. So if they go around bullying other companies or showing like a clear bias in the way that they report information, kind of like what's going on with politics right now and the whole like fake news movement, and like even Google is being sued by a couple different like people and companies as well because of how they're like reporting politics and stuff like that. So it's all just kind of a mess. But if they go around doing things like that, then yeah, there may actually need to be some heavier regulation. Now, I'm not saying that I'm particularly a fan of regulation, but sometimes you do actually need it, especially to protect things like freedom of speech and keeping the markets kind of free for competition as well. For example, if you were to like use Google to search for a competitor, maybe a smaller competitor, and say Google blocks the search results from that competitor because they don't want them to compete, then yeah, that would be obviously a big issue. But these are fixable issues. You just implement some heavier regulation, and these companies are so giant that some heavier regulation does make sense. And these are fixable problems. These are not events to really panic over, in my opinion. And as far as the whole like breaking up these companies goes and what you might end up with and things like that, well, that's also just heavy speculation. But these companies have so much value in them already. They're so diverse in themselves that if they were to be broken up, whatever you end up with would likely still be super valuable. And it would also present a lot of opportunities for other investors as well. Say you want to own something like Instagram, being able to buy Instagram stock would be a very attractive proposition. So if you end up owning Instagram stock, that would be a very valuable stock. Again, we don't know how any of this would play out, how these companies would break up and what you would own, and how that might result in the stock prices either climbing or falling. It's all speculation, but in my opinion, it's not a big enough reason to panic or to stay away from investing a lot of these really solid fundamental long-term stocks. Now, I do not own Facebook stock myself, and while I am interested in Facebook and I do still think that it's attractive even at these prices, I already have a lot of foundational stocks that I've built my portfolio around, like Microsoft, Amazon, and Disney. So I don't really need another one. And actually the next foundational stock that I'm really looking to buy in 2020, and I want to buy it pretty heavily, is Visa. And I feel like Visa kind of diversifies my portfolio, or it would diversify it a little bit more than something like Facebook would, because I do have some like digital advertising market share players already in my portfolio and pretty heavily, like Microsoft and Amazon. Those are my two biggest stocks. So I don't necessarily need Facebook, but something like Visa, Visa would be great for my portfolio. So, but if Facebook was to like dip at all in 2020, or again, like we have some kind of market correction or things like that, and it drags down Facebook even more, yes, it would be too attractive for me to ignore at that point, because I think it's already a great value, and even lower, again, it'd be too attractive for me to ignore. So anyway, that's how I feel about Facebook. I am very bullish on Facebook over the long term, but let me know if you guys agree with me or if you disagree. These are just kind of my quick thoughts and based on my own opinion, but I would love to hear your thoughts down below. And if you enjoyed the video, please consider hitting the like button. It really helps support the channel, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.